is where I'm located. Which is where I am located. So Toronto is the dish with one spoon territory. The dish with one spoon is a treaty between the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and Haudenosaunee that bound them to share the territory and protect the land. Subsequent Indigenous nations and peoples, Europeans, and all newcomers have been invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. So as everyone likely knows, we're here to have a really great conversation about the edited book volume, Family in the Time of COVID, International Perspectives. And I'm just going to take very few minutes to just introduce our speakers and our moderator today. So our moderator is Catherine Twomley, a professor of sociology at the UCL Social Research Institute, University College London. Catherine's research focuses on gender, love and intimacy, social policy, and families, with a particular interest in longitudinal and comparative research. And our first presenter today will be Ayesha Khan, who's a senior research fellow at the Gender Equality and Social Inclusion Program at ODI in the UK. And she brings over 30 years of research expertise in Pakistan and the region, with expertise in gender development and qualitative methodologies. And our second presenter will be Gabriela Marzonetto, who has a PhD in political science from the Universidad Nacional de San Martin in Argentina. And she's currently a visiting fellow at the Kellogg Institute for International Studies at Notre Dame University. And she's working on her first book project looking at childcare policy in Central America. And our third presenter today is Anita Mwanda, a sociology graduate from the University of Johannesburg, who currently serves as a research coordinator at the Center for Social Development at the University of Johannesburg, and she is dedicated to contributing to positive change through her work. So I think we're going to have a really fantastic conversation today, and I don't want to take up any more time. So I'm going to pass it over to Catherine, who's going to introduce the book to us.
Great. Thank you so much. Let me just get that up. Is that all looking good? Mm-hmm. Sorry, I just had to stop for a second. Great. Yes. So thank you so much to the Carework Network for this invitation. We're really happy to be here. And yeah, I'm one of the 3 editors of the book Family Life in the Time of COVID. You can see the book cover there, which we're very proud of. The other 2 editors are Humaira Iqbal and Charlotte Faircross, who unfortunately couldn't be here today, but they are here with us in spirit. So I'm just going to give a little bit of an overview of the book, why we did it, and pick out 1 or 2 small findings. I only have a few minutes, and then we're going to go on to the main reason that we're here to hear about the 3 chapters. So first of all, I just wanted to kind of give you an overview of when the project happened. So as I'm sure you will be aware, the COVID pandemic was sort of officially declared a global pandemic in March 2020. And we started our study in April 2020. So it was a very, very quick getting off the ground. Already in March, we were kind of thinking about it. And by April, some of the case studies were already collecting data. And then the last period of data collection was June 2021. So it was a longitudinal study across 10 different countries. Not all of the countries collected data of that entire period of time, but that was the longest period of time over the course of the consortium. So the objectives for us as a whole, so there's the project and the book is kind of the main output for us as a team, were to investigate responses to social distancing measures and to think about why do different people react to measures put in place in different ways, and what is it about their circumstances that constrain or enable particular behaviors. We had a particular focus on everyday life and, of course, in particular, a family life. So how does living through a pandemic shape everyday family life, education, work, and intimate relationships? So we were interested in this kind of nexus between the sociocultural context, the local and national policies and how they were enacted, and the individual and household circumstances. And so we're interested in what was happening in this moment in time in the pandemic as a kind of a historical moment, but we were also interested in how examining family life during the pandemic would help us understand the hidden and unacknowledged beliefs around, for example, the role of state in everyday life and personal, familial, community responsibility in managing risk, for example. So there was 10 case studies in our consortium, and we had, these are the 10 of them listed. And we came together with these shared objectives for the project. And as you can see, we tried to get together a team of scholars and researchers in various regions of the world. So the Americas, Europe, Asia, Africa. We were also trying to have case studies from countries who were reacting quite differently to the pandemic. So, for example, Sweden quite notoriously didn't really have any lockdown rules. It was more about recommendations versus Argentina, which you'll hear about soon, had a very long and very strict lockdown. And within this kind of cross-national, global kind of approach, thinking about local national policies and sort of international policies and how those cross-sected as much as possible. We also wanted to look at inter and intra-household differences and comparisons. So that is within a household, what difference it makes in terms of gender and generation. And then across households, what difference it makes socioeconomic resources and ethnicity. So in terms of our methodological aims, it was very much about capturing everyday life and practices, the interaction between policy and everyday life. We were drawing on the family practices, David Morgan's work, as well as sociology of the day, such as, well, there was various different people, but Les Back was one of the key theorists for us in the UK. And it was very much a relational study. So for that reason, it was a longitudinal multi-method, and the aspiration was to have data from all members of the family from the age of 12 up within a household. So sometimes you would have people in a household that weren't family and that were, depending on how it was interpreted in the different countries and by the different participants. So we had this set of 10 countries, and we all had these shared objectives and research questions, and we came together in the book. And then the book has these 10 chapters, one per country, and then an introduction chapter and a conclusion where we kind of brought together themes that we saw across the countries. So two of the kind of key themes I would say are around trust. So there was huge variations across the study around trust in political authorities and or interpersonal trust, though these were often linked. So for example, in Chile, the pandemic arrived at a time of civil unrest and political upheaval and in a heavily neoliberalized context. So it was very low trust in the government and a high amount of kind of felt and expressed personal responsibility to manage the pandemic, versus Taiwan, where there was very high levels of trust coming up the back of how the government had dealt with SARS, for example. Again, quite differently to South Africa, which you'll hear about. So very relevant to care, who has a responsibility to care for whom. And then this translated into different amounts of what we call COVID labor. So COVID labor is the new kind of work that one has to do in a pandemic. So seeking and interpreting information about what it means to be living in a COVID-19 pandemic, assessing the risk, should I leave the house, should I wear a mask, and so on, and then minimizing the risk, like buying masks, making masks, buying gel, and the amount of other kinds of resources it took to do that kind of COVID labor. And of course, that some people could minimize risk much easier. They could work from home versus sort of taxi drivers, for example, who dependent on money to be outside of their house. So that was just a whirlwind tour. And I just wanted to give you a quick idea of the full list of contributors in the book and from the 10 different country chapters. So I am then going to hand over to Ayesha, who will be talking about the chapter from Pakistan.
Thank you. Thanks, Catherine, for that introduction, and thank you so much for inviting us to present our work here today. Can all of you see the screen okay? Okay, so the collaborative research that we did in Pakistan brought together feminist researchers from different institutions who had a shared sense that we wanted to somehow capture the urgency of the moment and collect data in sort of a feminist and very empathic way of working out how best to use digital technologies to do ethnographic work under conditions of a pandemic. So it was really quite a challenge. Just to quick tell you about the timeline, in Pakistan, the pandemic, of course, started with a lockdown in March 2020, but lockdowns subsequent to that were intermittent. Most serious phase was between March and August of that year. And after that, there were like intermittent, small, localized lockdowns that really had traction that was not uniform across the country. The interesting thing, of course, about Pakistan was that we were, for reasons that we don't fully understand, protected in some measure from very large-scale deaths, although the numbers are still disputed. The research that we did focused on the city of Karachi, where all of us researchers were living at the time. Karachi is a city of 22 million people, so obviously we couldn't really get representative sampling in any way. But what we thought we would do is track over a period of 6 to 9 months, a cohort of families who agreed to be part of this research. Karachi being a very cosmopolitan city, allowed us to reach out to people who had varied cultural and ethnic backgrounds. There was some diversity in religious faith, which we thought may or may not have an impact on social exclusion or adherence to measures as a result of government policy. We interviewed multiple members of a given household, and all the households that we selected to participate in the study were multi-generational homes with at least 2, if not 3 or 4 generations living under one roof. Our sample was also of a varied income level. Some of them earned no more, some families owned no more than 200 some pounds per month, and others were quite wealthy. The main thesis of our chapter is that we found, based on the data that we gathered from these families through texts, videos, and online interviews, was that families developed new ways to care. They developed new, what we call gendered practices of recalibrating care to cope with an upended world. And you see here a picture of a very busy street in Karachi that is virtually empty during the period of lockdown. Now, the key concepts that guided our analysis was, of course, an understanding of care work as work that is affected by concern for the well-being of the recipient, and it may be paid, it may be unpaid, and it, of course, involves a great deal of intrinsic motivation, and that motivation itself is deeply gendered. We also wanted to take into account the emotional labor that is involved in care work to try to understand whether we could maybe get some insight into family life in Pakistan and the ambivalences and tensions that caregivers within the home might have. And I just wanted to draw attention to the fact that family life, emotional labor, and what is going on within the home is not an area that has been researched very much in Pakistan to date. So we grouped our data into an analysis of 3 dimensions of care. One was expressions of caring for that our research participants shared with us that had to do with how they cared for one another within the home and how they fulfilled what they saw as their family responsibilities, how they cared for other people outside of themselves. Of course, the takeaway finding from the caring for and the gendered angle of that is not going to be new to you, which is, of course, that gender roles were heightened rather than transformed within the home. And this was a finding that cut across all the diversity of our 27 families, regardless of their income level. We found that in homes where women had been working, such as the quote by this young woman who reflected on her mother here, who said that the gendered role became even more distinguishable with the once working women like my mother, now without the help of domestic help, houseworkers, she called them, having to transform into a superhuman. And this is a very interesting phenomenon in South Asia, which is that the exposure of the gender roles really came out in families where domestic help was suddenly not there, to allow women a little bit more flexibility in how they assumed their domestic responsibility. Suddenly, they didn't have any more help from outside the home, and the burden fell entirely on women and their daughters. Another dimension of course, caring for was how the caring for required women to do some very deep inner work of refining and retuning their inner life in order to ensure harmony within the home. You have here a comment of a woman who was the mother of 3 living in a home of 27 people at the time for the whole year of the pandemic. And she describes a real sort of sense of internal conflict where she told us about how, yes, she had fallen sick with COVID, but upon return from the hospital was meant to resume her domestic duties in the kitchen within 2 days. And then she says, but on the other hand, the pandemic gave us all an opportunity to become closer to one another. But on the other hand, I kept my boundaries by not giving free advice to anybody and not asking anybody for advice. So you see a lot of recalibration going on here as she tries to keep harmony within the home under extremely stressful circumstances. And you have another woman here saying that everything in the household really depended on me. I had to stay calm, otherwise everything would get disrupted. Another dimension of care that we found very enlightening in our research, especially with men, was the value that they felt for becoming community activists. Prior to COVID and the pandemic, they may not have been very involved in community work, but they felt a deep sense of satisfaction from engaging with the poorest in their neighborhoods and finding ways to give medical support, free time, help, cash, whatever was necessary in their communities. And it gave them a sense of inner satisfaction at a time where the world was upended, as I mentioned before. Of course, this was also very gendered, as you would know. The men are here not observing social distances, and maybe they're using the community work as a way to hang out with one another and meet new people outside the home during lockdown. I don't know, but I found that across our families, community work was a source of sustenance. And finally, self-care. Women reflected on the fact that they realized that if they didn't care for themselves during the crisis, they were not going to be able to do the emotional work required to keep the family together. And just to draw attention to one interesting dimension, some women, like this picture you see here of Karachi Central Jail, actually saw her community work in Central Jail as a doctor during COVID as a way of taking care of herself. Keeping herself sane was a way of looking after her family. And finally, another woman reflected on the importance of faith in keeping her going, and that was something that was resonant throughout our sample. So just to close, my slide is not moving. Oh yeah, so this is actually my last slide. So yeah, I'll just close with these reflections on what we called in our chapter Recalibrating Care. And I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And now we will have Gabby speaking about the chapter from Argentina.
Bueno, buenas tardes a todas y todos. Yo voy a hablar en español, así que espero que puedan leer las captions. Yo voy a presentar el caso de Argentina. Agradecemos primero a la Carework Network por habernos invitado en esta presentación del libro, pero también a Catherine, a Humera y a Charlotte por haber hecho tan extensiva esta invitación, en la cual participamos también desde Argentina Mariana de Santibáñez, junto conmigo y con un grupo de 9 asistentes de investigación que contribuyeron durante todo el periodo en el que trabajamos en este proyecto. Como comentó en un primer momento Catherine, el caso de Argentina fue uno que tuvimos un lockdown muy grande, fue de mucho tiempo, estuvimos como 9 meses en medidas de aislamiento total. Las clases para los niños y niñas de primaria y de secundaria estuvieron interrumpidas por 1 año y medio en varias partes de la Argentina, entonces esto afectó gran parte de alguna manera cómo fue afectando a las distintas personas y a las distintas familias los efectos de la pandemia, más allá de los miedos propios de la enfermedad y del virus por COVID. Nosotras hicimos una indagación en la que en primer lugar buscábamos ver la adhesión a las medidas sanitarias del gobierno por parte de las familias, pero después por otro lado, también con las lentes puestas en el enfoque de cuidados, quisimos ver distintos emergentes. Por un lado, indagar sobre las rutinas prepandemias y los efectos que tuvo la pandemia en las rutinas y las interacciones familiares durante todo este periodo de aislamiento, y otros emergentes que fueron surgiendo, y uno de los que más surgió fue el tema del miedo. Entonces yo voy ahora a presentarles de alguna manera estos 3 resultados sobre la adhesión a las medidas, sobre el miedo y después sobre las dinámicas en el uso del tiempo y los cambios que hubo entre la etapa prepandemia y la etapa de pandemia. Nosotras trabajamos con mujeres principalmente porque nos pasó en Argentina que los hombres eran un poco más reticentes a participar, participaron muy pocos varones durante el proceso, entonces tuvimos que quedarnos con un grupo de 37 mujeres que nos acompañaron en entrevistas durante 6 meses, mientras que los varones, bueno, teníamos un grupo muy reducido de 7 de ellos, y entonces por eso terminamos trabajando con la percepción que tenían las mujeres como jefas de hogar o como miembros de un hogar teniendo hijos e hijas a cargo o personas con necesidades de cuidado a su cargo. Lo que encontramos en un primer momento en términos de la adhesión a las medidas de gobierno fue que al principio las familias estaban de acuerdo con las medidas de restricción, pero ya con el correr de los meses, en el 4.º mes de aislamiento obligatorio, las familias empezaron a mostrar distintas posiciones. Y estas posiciones tuvieron un impacto muy grande. Podíamos ver que el impacto de estas posiciones estaba vinculado con las preferencias políticas. Es decir, la polarización política de la Argentina nos permea en todos los aspectos de la vida, e incluso sobre qué era lo que pensaban las familias sobre las medidas de aislamiento y distanciamiento social durante la etapa de pandemia. Esto vimos que se reflejó también en lo que tenía que ver con los miedos. El miedo fue un emergente que inicialmente no estábamos buscando. Nosotras estábamos indagando sobre la adhesión a las medidas gubernamentales y, por otro lado, sobre las rutinas y el uso del tiempo de las mujeres. Y encontramos que el miedo se convirtió en un referente recurrente durante los 6 meses que estuvimos realizando entrevistas. El miedo fue una de las expresiones más fuertes que encontramos de manera transversal. No importaba la clase social ni el bagaje familiar de las familias, nos hablaban de miedo. Y podíamos de alguna manera construir los distintos miedos que encontramos, y era por un lado el de perder la fuente de ingresos y de trabajo, el de enfermarse y que el sistema sanitario no pudiera hacerse cargo de la enfermedad y terminaran muriendo ellas o sus familias, y uno que fue recurrente y transversal y estuvo presente durante todo el tiempo a partir de las entrevistas de septiembre de 2020 hasta marzo de 2021, fue sobre la salud mental de los hijos e hijas. Esto sobre todo por la situación de tener las escuelas cerradas por tanto tiempo. Nosotros después hicimos una indagación también con esto que decía de ponernos los lentes del cuidado, sobre cómo habían sido los vínculos y las interacciones y las dinámicas del día a día previas a la pandemia y durante la pandemia. Para eso nos valimos de una herramienta que fue de mucha utilidad, que fue el Care Map. Utilizamos y readaptamos la idea del atlas de cuidado y les pedimos a las familias, a través de las interacciones que teníamos por Zoom o por videollamada de WhatsApp, que fueran dibujando cómo eran las interacciones que tenían en su día a día con los miembros de la familia, pero con otros miembros también de la comunidad en la que se vinculaban. Y fue a partir de ahí que empezamos a observar los cuidados, no solamente en términos de aquellas actividades para la sostenibilidad de la vida y estas actividades que llevamos adelante de trabajo reproductivo, muchas veces no remunerado en los hogares, sino también en términos de los efectos emocionales del cuidado y de las interacciones sociales y cómo esto afecta cómo percibimos los cuidados y cómo nos vinculamos en términos de comunidad. Esto fue de alguna manera un punto de inflexión en el proceso de entrevistas porque permitió mucha apertura de las entrevistadas y nos encontramos con una serie de, podríamos decir, patrones que tenían que ver con el tipo de bagaje de las personas entrevistadas que teníamos. Nosotros habíamos reclutado a mujeres trabajadoras de casas particulares a partir de un contacto con el Sindicato de Empleadas de Casas Particulares de Argentina. Por lo tanto, estas mujeres tenían la particularidad de ser trabajadoras formales, lo que es un número muy reducido de las empleadas domésticas de la Argentina. Solo el 25% de ellas están en situación de formalidad, entonces estaban de alguna manera protegidas porque estaban garantizadas una licencia paga para ellas durante el tiempo que durara el aislamiento, pagada por los empleadores. Entonces esta situación de alguna manera nos hizo ver una faceta de los efectos de cómo les afectó el cambio de rutina entre la prepandemia y la pandemia a las mujeres trabajadoras de casas particulares, y por otro lado teníamos mujeres profesionales y mujeres de clase media que también trabajaban por fuera de sus hogares, y encontramos una serie de patrones. El patrón más claro fue que la vida prepandemia era muy ajetreada y el tiempo de traslado era un emergente muy fuerte. Veíamos que mientras que las mujeres profesionales y de clase media que reportaban llevar a sus hijos a la escuela, después ir al trabajo, después llevarlos a actividades extraescolares, pasaban mucho tiempo en trayectos, de alguna manera yendo de un lado hacia otro, pero que tenían tiempo para llevar adelante actividades que a ellas las reconfortara, como juntarse con amigas, ir al club, aprender un idioma. Mientras que cuando hablábamos con las empleadas de casas particulares nos encontrábamos que la mayor parte de su tiempo la pasaban en el colectivo, en el transporte público, yendo de un lugar a otro, de un trabajo a otro, con jornadas muy largas, muy extensas, donde la vida pasaba por el trabajo. Pero en el momento de este aislamiento tan amplio que tuvimos, y como les estaba contando, encontramos que pudimos generar de alguna manera insights en 3 direcciones distintas que nos llevaron a ver que habían cosas positivas dentro de esta situación, y es que en las interacciones sociales encontramos que las mujeres que antes, así como contaba Ayesha para el caso de Pakistán, las mujeres que tenían la posibilidad de contratar servicios de cuidado y domésticos en sus hogares se vieron sobrecargadas por las tareas de cuidado, se vieron abrumadas y vieron la necesidad de tener un espacio propio, aún en sus propios hogares, sobre todo porque se les acortó el tiempo de ocio y de recreatividad. Mientras que encontramos otros 2 patrones distintos en el caso de las mujeres trabajadoras y las mujeres en particular trabajadoras de casas particulares, que fue de alguna manera la apropiación de sus propios hogares. Por primera vez en la vida se encontraron con tiempo para generar interacciones con sus familias, y se encontraron con tiempos para disfrutar de limpiar sus hogares, aunque parezca, o sea, nosotras lo veíamos con los lentes de las mujeres profesionales que necesitaban su espacio propio, y nos encontramos de alguna manera en el proceso de reflexividad que generó este proyecto, con que la necesidad de un espacio de adueñarse de sus propios hogares que tenían estas mujeres. Entonces, por eso, de alguna manera, pudimos hacer como 3 patrones que encontramos. La necesidad de las mujeres que antes contaban con tiempo de esparcimiento y tiempo de ocio, de encontrar un espacio propio que se les había sido negado en el momento de la pandemia. Mientras que, por otro lado, aquellas mujeres que carecían completamente de estos tiempos, redescubrieron facetas de su vida que no conocían previamente, y de sus hogares y de las interacciones con sus familiares que eran escasas. Entonces, para cerrar, lo que me gustaría decir es que si bien hacia el final de las entrevistas, ya en el último tramo también aparecía la ansiedad y el miedo, como les decía, que fue frecuente durante todo el proceso de indagación, encontramos también la ansiedad por el fin de las medidas sanitarias de la pandemia. Encontramos con que muchas de las mujeres entrevistadas reportaban tener ansiedad de volver a los espacios que habían habitado prepandemia. Entonces encontramos ahí que de alguna manera las mujeres que participaron en este estudio fueron conscientes por primera vez, y así nos lo reportaron muchas de ellas, del tiempo que dedicaban en su vida a cuidar, pero no solamente a cuidar, sino a moverse de un lado a otro en términos de las relaciones de cuidado. El commute time vinculado a los cuidados era muy fuerte, y sobre esto querían reflexionar y hacer cambios en su vida. Voy cerrando para darle paso a Anita y seguimos en las preguntas.
Gracias, Gaby. So yes, now we'll have Anita Mwanda, who'll be talking about the South African chapter.
Sorry, could you just add me as a presenter again? Sorry, I just dropped.
I can't do that. It has to be Cynthia, I think.
That should work now.
Thank you. Okay, so I'll be presenting on or providing insights on the caregiving roles from South Africa. Okay. So during COVID-19, South Africa experienced challenges of high rates of violence, poverty, and unemployment. And this was largely due to a root cause, which is the apartheid legacy and patriarchal structures that perpetuate these inequalities. Just to give context, a big majority of the households in South Africa are female-headed households, which is pretty common, and they are particularly vulnerable to poverty and food insecurity, right? So this was further exacerbated by COVID-19, in which we saw that women shouldered a disproportionate burden of unpaid care work, which limited their employment opportunities while exacerbating gender disparities. So the COVID pandemic triggered widespread disruptions in employment across various structures, and the lockdown and social distancing measures led to job losses, reduced working hours, and the closure of businesses. remote work became very prevalent in South Africa, and basically altered the traditional workplace dynamics. But for a lot of the vulnerable families, particularly those who are in sectors like hospitality and retail, they were severely affected. Also, given that a lot of the families that participated in the study were basically had low or lower socioeconomic status, and this meant that remote work wasn't necessarily possible for everyone, given that not everyone has access to resources like data, telephonic devices like computers, etc. And so that made it difficult for women particularly to continue with employment. So during COVID-19, women basically bore the brunt of job losses, especially during the initial phases of the pandemic, and experienced slower employment recovery compared to their male counterparts. And despite their increased caregiving responsibilities due to school closures, women received less income support than men. And this further exacerbated the existing gender inequalities, which underscore the need for targeted interventions and support mechanisms in South Africa. So our study basically, we started the recruitment process in mid-June 2020. And we used, we leveraged our existing networks and community WhatsApp groups to recruit participants. Through this, the study was ethnographic, so we had about 21 families, most of which, as you can see, did have basically came from what we would describe or stayed in brick houses, etc., and did have access to water, flushable toilets, etc. But when it came down to resources like food and stuff, a lot of our families just relied on almost like food parcels. So this was either donated by government, mostly NGOs stepped in during the pandemic. And then we had about 21 families, which was quite a small sample. We had one family leave, but we basically, in order to make up for that, we used qualitative interviews. And then, like I said, the recruitment process took place in mid-June 2020 up until March 2021. And then based on our findings, like I said, women were mostly affected, you know, with small things like adhering to lockdown measures. What we found is that women were more likely to stay indoors, look after their families, whereas the men would obviously put them at greater risk. For example, we have quotes from some of our participants who basically expressed the awareness of their hardships. So, for example, one participant said that, "Here we are struggling because we have to cross the street, knock at people's doors to get our phones charged." And somehow they're able to adapt to that. And that's because not a lot of our participants had access to electricity all the time. We also experience and are still experiencing load shedding. Some of the participants expressed that the burden of care increased. And so because because the children were not able to go to schools, they had to care for their households, make sure that, you know, homework and all of that was still being done while also caring for their children, right? In addition, financial struggles were exacerbated by job losses that a lot of our participants experienced, which made it extremely difficult for families to afford basic necessities. So over here, quotes from participants provide insight into their experiences and emotions during this challenging time. You know, some participants one participant expressed that she was suffering with depression and anxiety. Another expressed that having kids is hard. So most of our participants express feeling overwhelmed by their responsibilities and worried about their ability to provide for their families. You know, in addition to the emotional toll of lockdown, which included, like I said, feelings of worry, anxiety, and depression, which was really significant for most of our participants. So, in conclusion, women's roles during this study basically highlighted that their roles go beyond just care work, but also include taking care of their households. And a lot of the time, you'll find that the participants who are women also had to balance their breadwinning duties, which led to increased stress and economic worry. The pandemic obviously worsened gender inequalities in South Africa and threatened the undergoing progress that we had in terms of women empowerment. And our studies, our findings basically underscore the need for urgent and targeted interventions to address these gender disparities and support women in navigating the challenges that were exacerbated by the pandemic, but that women in South Africa still today experience. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Anita. And indeed to three lead authors or authors on those chapters. I think Ayesha mentioned it was quite noticeable that across all our 10 country case studies, women were taking up more of the COVID labor, as we called it, than the men. There was some of an uptick, but we see this in so many other studies as well. But I guess kind of leading on from that, a question I had for you, Ayesha, was about the adolescents and the young people in your study, and whether what happened there about different kinds of duties. Did you see that kind of gendered pattern, or was it slightly different? And I'm going to ask a question to all three of you, and then you can all respond one by one, and then we'll open it up to others. And Gabby, yeah, you used the care map, which was quite unique amongst the studies, but very much fitted in with what you were finding. I was wondering if you could tell us a bit more detail about that. And Anita, I wondered if you could tell us a little bit more about the digital methods and the engagement with the participants, considering the kind of poor resource situations in which they were coming from. So yeah, I guess if we go in the order of the chapters presented, that would be Ayesha, then Gabby, then Anita again.
Okay, yes, thanks, Catherine, for that question, because actually we did do some in-depth interviews with a group of 12 adolescents to try to get some insight into their daily lives and what was going on with them during the pandemic. And we found that both young adolescent boys as well as girls expressed greater intensity of their bonds with their siblings, parents, and particularly grandparents. But that greater intensity of the bonding also brought with it a high level of anxiety around the health and welfare, especially of their grandparents and the more vulnerable members of their households. But with respect to the gender division of labor, it's important to mention that children, even younger than age 12, the girls were spending a lot of time in the kitchen with their mothers. They were doing schoolwork online, plus they were expected to participate in the increased domestic labor. That added to the stress of their lives, also to their isolation and the missing that they had of their school friends, which was, a theme throughout, resonant throughout the adolescent interviews. So yes, it was gendered, it was also worrying. And the undue responsibility of domestic work is something that it fell definitely on the hands of not only adolescent girls, but even prepubescent girls.
Thanks. Gabby?
Bien, en relación a la pregunta sobre el Care Map, si nosotras ya en la tercera ronda de entrevistas que realizamos decidimos tomar el Atlas of Caregiving como ejemplo y a partir de ahí adaptarlo en el sentido de que les pedimos a las participantes que dibujaran sus interacciones de cuidado previas a la pandemia con un color y durante la pandemia con otro color en el mismo mapa. Entonces, de alguna manera se contrastaron las interacciones de cuidado que se llevaban adelante y ahí realmente fue el momento, de alguna manera, un antes y un después en la dinámica de las entrevistas, porque a partir de ese ejercicio se abrieron muchísimo más las entrevistadas, pero también surgió un proceso de una reflexión profunda porque se encontraron con las interacciones sociales que llevaban adelante con sus familias, con su familia nuclear, que vivían todos juntos durante la pandemia, y cómo eran las interacciones previas a la pandemia, pero también sobre sus familias ampliadas, sobre sus compañeros y compañeras de trabajo, sobre las familias de los compañeros de los hijos de la escuela, sobre la comunidad en general y cómo de alguna manera tenían un impacto. Reconocieron la interacción social y la importancia que tenía en sus vidas y en el bienestar de sus familias, las interacciones con personas por fuera de la familia, y también empezaron a reconocer cómo habían cambiado las dinámicas familiares. A esto se le siguió en la siguiente ronda un ping-pong de preguntas y respuestas sobre cómo se organizaban las actividades de cuidado y las tareas domésticas dentro de los hogares, y a partir de esto fue de donde pudimos destrabar de alguna manera y descubrir junto con las participantes los efectos que estaban teniendo en la vida cotidiana la pandemia sobre cada una de las personas. La verdad es que fue un ejercicio fascinante y debo decir en términos hasta de reflexividad que terminamos llorando todas en algunos de los casos, incluso nosotras como entrevistadoras, facilitadoras del proceso.
Great, thank you. It also makes me reflect so soon within the pandemic. It was hard to remember pre-pandemic, like our everyday life became normalized so quickly. So the data collection we did in kind of April, May, just April, May, I would say, was like the shock of, oh my gosh, I need to remember masks and, things are changing. But after that, like June already, it was like established. And then I remember kind of near the end of the period of the study, people were like, we're always going to be wearing masks now. That's the new normal. That's never going to change. I never see masks anymore. The ability of us to adapt and shift and change as human beings is just kind of fascinating to me. But anyway, I'm going off on a tangent.
Yeah.
Anita,
Probably Anita, yeah.
yes, if you could respond as well, that'd be great.
So, I mean, like I mentioned, we leveraged on our networks. And once we had participants who agreed to participate, we decided to use WhatsApp as a means of communication. So we would send out weekly prompts. In the beginning, we had all our participants basically create, I think it was a minute video just introducing themselves. and basically describing what their family setup was like, who they stayed with. We quickly found that a lot of our participants were women, and children, obviously. The male participants that we had they didn't participate for long. So most of our data includes, or the images includes pictures of children playing, mothers doing homework with their kids, etc. As the phases of COVID went by, and people could go back to work and etc., we found that we struggled to get responses back. So we subsidized that with qualitative calls. So we would call them just to follow up on questions. But yeah, WhatsApp was obviously the easiest way for us to also collect data, because we have, when you buy like data this side, you're able to get like WhatsApp bundles. So that proved to obviously be a lot better.
Thank you. Yeah, there was a lot of different ways of devising the methods for the kind of contextualizing in the different places. That's really helpful. I just put in the chat, I know we're kind of out of time, but if you do have a question that you feel like we could answer very quickly, or if you want to put one in the chat, or also, of course, if you want to email us afterwards, I also just put the link for our book, which is free to download, in the chat. What do you think, Cynthia, Naomi? Can we kind of prolong for another 5 to 10 minutes, or?
Maybe 5. We did start late, but I know we're kind of here. It's late for you and the UK, and here we're sort of picking up childcare time. But is there maybe one question from anyone who's not on the panel that you want to ask? I mean, I was just going to ask a question about what was the most surprising finding for each of you in your case studies. I mean, in some ways, the gendered reproduction of the gendered inequalities is not surprising. Maybe it's not surprising because we all lived it, or because we saw other studies that have confirmed it. But when you were in the study, I mean, were there other insights? Were you surprised at how much children did? Were you surprised at how much men did? Were there other surprising kind of findings that you wouldn't have thought about? That's to any or all 3 of you, whoever wants to jump in.
Sure, I can.
Yeah, Ayesha, you go ahead, and then Gabby.
Yeah, just one surprising finding that I didn't mention in my presentation was that I think that participants began to look at their employers through a care lens to see who was worth working with, based on the extent to which they appeared to care for their employees during the pandemic. We even had a respondent who changed jobs for this reason. So I thought that was interesting, that the recalibration of care also extended to the paid work sector.
Interesting.
Yo iba a ir por algo muy parecido también a lo que descubrieron en Pakistán con el equipo de Ayesha. Nosotras encontramos con que llevó a reflexiones profundas sobre la vida, más allá del día a día. Fue realmente quiero pasar tantas horas de mi vida yendo de un lugar a otro, transportándome para ir a trabajar de una casa a la otra. De hecho, muchas de las empleadas domésticas que participaron en nuestro estudio tomaron la decisión de empezar cursos de peluquería, de manicuría, con la idea de dejar los trabajos que tenían, porque empezaron a reflexionar sobre algo que tenían naturalizado. Habían naturalizado que sus vidas iban a ser levantarse a las 5 de la mañana y acostarse a las 10 de la noche sin ver a su familia, de lunes a sábado y descubrieron que podían disfrutar del hogar, que podían hacer otras cosas. Esa fue una de las claves que nos hizo
Muy
ver el lado bueno de la
interesante.
pandemia también.
Qué bueno. Anita, did you have anything that you wanted to share about what was exciting or surprising, and it may be exciting but surprising?
I just think one thing that I always think about is how efficient it was to get the safety measures out. So we have 11 official languages in South Africa. And so the reliance on radio, television, WhatsApp chain messages, etc., you know, just to get people in the rural areas also just to understand like the severity of COVID-19.
Thank you.
Great. Well, you know, on behalf of the Carework Network, I just want to thank all of our panelists for sharing really interesting case studies and kind of highlighting things that maybe we're thinking about before, but maybe in new light, and also some certainly new findings that I hadn't thought about in terms of care and families and the pandemic and where we were then and where we were now. So it was really an enjoyable conversation for us who were listening and watching, and we have been recording this. So we will be sharing this on our website and others can share it. And I think it's going to be a really great resource for teaching and also for research for others in the field. So thank you again for generously sharing your time. And we look forward and hope to see everyone at future Carework Network events.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.